asked if I wanted to stop by a mutual friend of ours' house because he wanted to pick up some cocaine. And he said sure. He asked me if I wanted to go up. He knew it had been a long time since I'd seen Peter. He parked the car and we went up there, and he had 6 of his friends waiting for me. I remember them like having sex with me. I don't remember them hurting me, like physically beating me or anything like that. I guess after like the 3rd or 4th one, I passed out.
What you were listening to was an excerpt from the 1992 album Buyer's Market, created by Peter Sotos and produced by the late Steve Albini.
My name's Mars. That's my mother's tacky sense of humor. And I left home when I was 13 because my stepbrother raped me. And I didn't try and find my real father because he was going to have me raped anyway, according to my mother. So I ended up being on the street, living in a lot of different places. And now I live in Boston and I work as a stripper.
It is a 61-minute compilation of interviews, news reports, law enforcement recordings, victim statements, and parents' testimonies of some of the most horrific kinds of acts a human could do to another person, especially to young children. Real-life accounts of pedophilia, rape, and extreme forms of violence played back-to-back with no breathing space in between to create one collective voice of trauma and the darkness that humanity is capable of.
We found out she had been defecated on, that it was smeared all over her body and put in her mouth.
The reception of the album, if you can call it that, is and was understandably hostile. A quick browse on sites like Reddit, Rate Your Music, and Album of the Year will reveal an overwhelmingly negative response to the work, with the main criticisms calling the album exploitative, performative, hypocritical, and for the most part, morally reprehensible. As someone who has always taken a perhaps excessive amount of intellectual curiosity in all that garners reactions like this, I sat down and listened to the project in its entirety and delved deeper into the sordid rabbit hole of Peter Sotos' work. What I found next was Sotos' magnum opus and most infamous work, Pure, a self-published zine from 1984, entirely dedicated to serial killers, sex criminals, and Nazism, being the first of its kind to do so. The work, which I regrettably have copies of now on my hard drive, is entirely unique in its coverage of these twisted tales because Pure does not, at any point, condemn these perpetrators. In fact, it does the complete opposite. The first page of the first volume opens up with a quote from Joseph Goebbels. "Man is and remains an animal. Here, a beast of prey, there, a house pet, but always an animal." And then is followed by the publication's manifesto. In our search for extremes, we are constantly bombarded with humanist, feminist, and other equally asinine diatribes that writers employ to alleviate the strain of their conscience, or to try and seduce us into their maudlin world of false securities and self-contempt. Pure exists, then, for those who desire extremes and are tired of listening to and or acting like house pets. Pure satiates and encourages true lusts. There is no need to convince outsiders of a philosophy, nor any reason to hide or pawn our tastes and instincts off as a moralistic examination of the dark side of human nature. There is no mission to force a begrudged acceptance of the supposed true state of the human condition. We offer no such safeties. And monetary concerns aside, new liberal and free-thinking converts are of little use. Pure exists for those who want it. What follows is an account of the true story of Robin Getch's attack on African-American prostitute Beverly Washington. For some context, Robin Getch was the leader of the Ripper Crew, an organized crime group in Chicago, Illinois, comprised of 4 men who, through the years of 1981 to 1982, would murder 17 people by beheading, dismembering, disemboweling, and flaying. In this instance that Sotos chooses to write about, Beverly Washington actually survived her encounter with Getch, and although had her left breast amputated, her testimony eventually led to the capture of the Ripper Crew and their subsequent incarceration. The experience I had reading this account was rare in the sense I could not wait until it was over. There is an unavoidable sense of complicity one feels when reading Sotos' work, not because of the subject matter, but because of the way Sotos chooses to write about it. He refers to Beverly primarily using racial slurs and misogynistic rhetoric and constantly portrays her as a stupid and naive young woman whose story could only make quote-unquote insects feel bad for her. Her real story of being groomed into prostitution and suffering a life-altering and horrific attack from Brecht is rendered as typical, obvious, and even enjoyable, with every detail being stripped of sentimentality or tact in favour of blunt and coarse descriptions of hairy cocks, whoring, and money-hungry slatterns. On the contrary, Goethe is portrayed as the hero of the story, described as brave, who solidified the black woman as the quote, shit she and her entire race and gender is. The entire zine is like this. All 3 volumes whose accounts are accompanied by real pictures from the crimes. Some so disgusting that Peter Sotos would end up actually being arrested and charged as a sex offender for using real child pornography. Upsetting and morally reprehensible, of course, but what's so interesting about comparing Pure's accounts to the sterilised and diplomatic accounts from news sources or true crime documentaries is that they are all describing the exact same thing that millions of us enjoy consuming with pleasure. We can say that we don't do this, but according to Forbes, the true crime industry is a multi-billion-dollar juggernaut whose profits rapidly grow each year. People do want this, but they want it in their own way, a way that doesn't make them feel complicit, a way that is presented to them free of moral ambiguity. Sigmund Freud, in his essay Taboo and Emotional Ambivalence, argues that although we fear the taboo, we simultaneously desire it. I agree that it is quite clear that humanity desires the things it prohibits when you look at the litany of content surrounding taboos, although I disagree with him that our prohibition is a result of desire. I believe it is the other way around, and much more in line with George Bataille's theory of transgression, and that through transgression a human being can become aware of its own moral, social, and therefore real limits. The confrontation with the limits of one's existence is a particularly sublime and exquisite sensation, and oftentimes highly pleasurable. The comfort one gets from having a YouTube video play in your room whilst you go to sleep, describing some of the most abhorrent acts ever committed, or the fascination and intrigue of the dense descriptions of violence in a Cormac McCarthy novel. It is clear that an itch is being scratched, but it is also important that we do not view ourselves as complicit. Pure, whatever its intentions are, disrupt this demand entirely, exposing the consumer-supply relationships as one of moral reinforcement. We want to endlessly consume horrific stories of murder and mutilation, but as long as we, the consumer, leave the experience with our superego intact. If the reporting does not mediate, it is shunned. It seems that, even in its most extreme forms, transgression does have the ability to shed some light on these invisible moral proclivities that we all share, and so I wanted to look a little deeper into the history of transgression alongside humanity's evolution to see how potentially enlightening it can be. The English term taboo derives from the Polynesian word tapu, simply meaning forbidden or prohibited, depending on what culture used the word. In 1777, British explorer James Cook invited some of the Tongan aristocracy from his visit to the island onto his ship to have dinner with him and his crew, but was surprised to find that not one of them would have a bite of the food Cook had prepared, and they wouldn't even sit down. When Cook expressed his shock to the aristocracy, they explained to him that his hospitality and his food was taboo, and therefore forbidden to indulge in. It's interesting to me that Cook was surprised at this response. I imagine that in the moment it was chalked up to a foreign and primitive superstition, but this practice of deeming things forbidden has a long-standing history within humanity since the formation of civilizations. In the book Purity and Danger, Mary Douglas traces the etymology of the emergence of taboo by first looking towards how civilizations are formed in the first place. She argues that for a civilization to function, it must have a shared perception of reality between its inhabitants. The way in which this is achieved is through classification. Reality becomes divided into categories, first starting with more obvious distinctions such as male and female and human and animal, but then moves into the more intangible aspects such as sacred and profane. Once a distinction between two opposing categories is established, meaning can be instilled by the civilization, and a coherent cultural worldview can be acted upon. She suggests that what is considered dirty and profane isn't that which is first and foremost unhygienic, but actually something that is out of place among these distinctions. Dirt is matter out of place, as she says. For example, food only becomes dirty once it is put in a place it does not belong, such as in someone's clothing or in someone's bed, but remains perfectly acceptable if it is presented according to the culture's categories, such as food served on a plate or on a table. A taboo is therefore not an objective property, but something entirely context-dependent, created by what it is threatening. This is what makes Sotos' work so contentious, as well as other transgressive artists. As understood through Douglas's theory of anomaly, pure, irreversible, and 120 Days of Sodom resist classification within distinctions, and as already mentioned, a society depends heavily on categories and distinctions to function, and these distinctions must also be applied to the most abhorrent parts of human nature. Take a look at any of the true crime documentaries on YouTube or Netflix and you will see clear as day what I'm referring to. When investigating things like murder, torture and rape, there must always be a very stable and clear distinction between victim and perpetrator. The victims are never condemned, even in the slightest, which I would argue isn't completely out of respect, but also out of fear of confusing the distinction that our society's justice system and moral frameworks are founded upon. It isn't just Ted Bundy raping and murdering Linda Ann Healy, it is evil preying on the innocent and holy victim. When this order is destabilized, people get uncomfortable. In Pure, Sotos writes about the Moore murders with the cadence of an admirer, deifying Ian and Myra Brady as Übermenschlichen artists unrestrained by traditional morality, who achieved great feats in their actions, paired with the images of the crimes as evidence. There is no trace of empathy for the victims in his writing, only verbose admiration for the perpetrator. Sotos does the same for his descriptions of the Nazis and the awful things they did during the 1940s, sharing images with us some of the most despicable atrocities you'll ever see, along with swastikas and direct quotes from those in charge of these operations. This is disgusting, and whatever you think of this, I think it's important I personally don't believe Sotos is being genuine here, although he probably won't admit it out of fear of being labelled as a reactionary or a theorist. I don't believe he is actually an admirer of these individuals and ideologies, and in fact I suspect he's probably the complete opposite. His work, first and foremost, is to threat this social order Mary Douglas talks about, without mediation and without interpretation. It is pure, unmediated assaults on morality by encompassing everything about these subject matters that society rejects. When the spectator is amidst this disorientating effect of having their symbolic boundaries exposed, there isn't much left to do other than condemn what made them feel that way. It returns them to stability. I believe that when someone sees something like Pure, or even more casually hears a news report about a beheading or a rape, they are understandably repulsed, but they also secretly gain some pleasure and security from their reaction too. When you hear the true story, a story that happened only recently, of a man in the UK, a white man, who broke into a Sikh woman's home to beat her and rape her as a form of a racist attack, you will find security in your own repulsion. You will know that I am not like this man. I am different from this man. He is dirt, I am not. He is bad, I am good. And my disgust is proof of that fact. The spectator takes pleasure in remaining obedient to his social order. This is transgression's purpose, to reveal the existence of moral limits within a social order. The desired object is desired because it is forbidden, but once that desire is exposed, the limit is violated and the social order is illuminated, making some curious but many uncomfortable. When one's social order is threatened simply by being able to see that it is a sum of its parts, their entire perception of reality suffers a blow in legitimacy, confronting the agent with genuine freedom and chaos. This reminds me of a very funny Instagram comedy video by Ricky Ireland, in which Ricky poses as a Walmart employee and kindly asks to see the receipt of a male shopper who is about to exit the store. The man, following instructions, hands his receipt over to Ricky, only for Ricky to put the receipt in his mouth and eat it. Despite this event having no considerable consequence for the man, he loses his mind and resorts to hysterics, pleading for someone to restore his reality to its bearings, asking for a manager, asking for the CCTV to be reviewed, and threatening to call the police. He panics not because he is in danger, but because the classifications that construct his reality have been rendered temporarily absurd. Both Georges Bataille and Michel Foucault have both stated that transgression does not break any rules, nor disobey them. Rather, transgression is the act of crossing a limit, while simultaneously revealing the existence of that limit. Foucault, in his essay A Preface to Transgression, uses the analogy of a lightning strike in the nighttime. The flash illuminates the darkness surrounding it, but the flash only exists because of the darkness surrounding it. Transgression and order have an inseparable and dynamic relationship. One only notices moral fragility, journalistic conventions, and consumer hypocrisy when Sotos decides to write the way he does about the subject matter he chooses to write about. Ideology is never more visible than when it is being violated, which is why I have some contention with the very fair critique that Sotos' work erases his victims and exploits them. On the surface, this is a very reasonable critique to make. He uses photos and audio clippings of real victims who really did suffer, and describes them in ways purposefully meant to defile their memory in service of aggrandizing their murderer or rapist. But I have never felt so disgusted at a true crime story than I did of Sotos' recounting of Robin Getch's attack on Beverly, Washington. The expose of my own moral framework in such an abrasive and immediate fashion made me so much more empathetic of just how evil the world can be, and how monstrous and sadistic the attack on Beverly, Washington really was. Far more than any 6-part Netflix documentary series could ever accomplish. I had immediate and unmediated access to my own moral interpretations of the event, and so, paradoxically, the violation of moral assumptions in such a transgressive manner in fact reinforces the consciousness of the account's moral weight. Therefore, it is important to remember that the purpose of transgression is never to destroy moral categories, but to investigate them. Whatever you think of Peter Sotos' intentions, when the invisible is made visible, like Pure's use of language, it is only then that one can bring out the microscope. Pure exposes a hypocritical society that desires taboo as long as it is mediated, compliant, and ignorant of that depraved desire, so that reality can remain manageable. The taboo in Pure is not its brutality, but the desire for it. An ugly mirror held up against the fragility of one's morally certain smile that secretly holds within it an intense and desperate craving for all that will disgust it.
Katie had been so brutalized that Tom said the only thing that looked like her were the freckles on her face and the braces on her teeth. She was such a good little kid and such a regular kid. To allow a child like that to be destroyed was so hard.